Today we're going to be talking about some Pulumi concepts for beginners. And so if you are familiar with Pulumi, many of the things we'll be going over again. But the point of this workshop is to get you a grounding in some of the core Pulumi concepts that you may or may not be familiar with. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping things. You can follow along with the workshop. If you take a look at the handouts tab on the right hand side, you can see a link to the code that I'm going to be using today. Many of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today are language agnostic inside Pulumi, so they're available in all of our SDKs. And if you're familiar with the language, with any of the languages that we support from the Node.js ecosystem, Python, Go, and the .NET ecosystem, we are going to be learning about the concepts. I will be using Python today for these examples, but you can basically follow along in any of the languages that you feel familiar with. A reminder to join the community Slack. There is a workshops channel in the Slack there, and again in the handouts that you can see a link to that to sign up. And of course, as I mentioned, this is my first workshop here, and we're always iterating on the content, especially in this new times where in-person workshops are not possible. So please feel free to give us feedback via Slack in the workshops channel, and there will be a follow-up email and a couple of polls that we'll do during the course of this content. So before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is Pulumi. You may be familiar with Pulumi already, but I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about exactly what Pulumi is. Pulumi is a modern infrastructure as code platform. There are alternatives in the space, but what differentiates Pulumi from our competitors is that we use familiar programming languages and tools that you may be familiar with from the software development lifecycle. So instead of using a configuration language or a custom DSL to define your cloud infrastructure, you can use the programming languages that you are familiar with from your application development lifecycle and define the infrastructure declaratively in those imperative languages. We pride ourselves on the idea that we are available for the entire cloud organization. We have many infrastructure engineers using our platform, as well as many front-end and back-end software engineers. With this approach, it means that you are able to kind of define the infrastructure as code methodologies in a language that your users and your organization feels comfortable with. What is the Pulumi platform? The Pulumi platform consists of two separate but very, very related components. We have what we call the Pulumi SDK, which includes all of our language SDKs in all of the different languages we support, and also the Pulumi CLI. You can use Pulumi with none of the Pulumi Enterprise console and SaaS, and those options are available for you. But we also have the Pulumi console, which manages collaboration and state management for your organization. We have a free tier for individuals and a team and enterprise solution, which you can use as well. The idea here is that we are meeting everybody on common grounds. So if you are an open source user, you can do the same things that you could do as an enterprise user in the console. As I mentioned before, you can define your infrastructure in any of the languages that you see before you. Because we support these different language ecosystems, it allows you to kind of use the tooling that you are familiar with in your workflow. And you can see here, these are some examples of the editors and the tools and the package management options that you would use. And if you're a software developer and you're familiar with any of these languages, you can just kind of pick up these tools and use them straight away. I'll be using VS Code today for the examples. As I mentioned before, I'll be using Python. But all of these tools are available to you to allow you to kind of get involved in the ecosystem and define the code in the language that define the infrastructure in the code and the language that you feel comfortable and familiar with. So before we actually get into some of the examples, I'd first like to introduce some of the terminology that I'm going to be using today to get you familiar with the ideas behind Pulumi. And there'll be a few examples here, but the intent really is to kind of make sure that when I'm going to go through these very, very straightforward examples that I mentioned before, that I don't use any language or terminology that you might feel is unclear. So before we kind of get into the nitty gritty things, let's first talk about what a Pulumi resource is. In the Pulumi in a Pulumi application or a Pulumi infrastructure declared infrastructure, a resource is any object or anything that Pulumi manages the lifecycle of, and it's a very, very broad term because there are so many different resources that are available across all of the different providers that we support. It can be as simple as an S3 bucket or a security group rule in AWS to a fully managed Kubernetes cluster in any of your cloud providers. You define these resources, as you can see here in this TypeScript example. You define these resources using the language that you feel comfortable with, as I mentioned many times before. And this is an imperative decision. So when you write the code, it's imperative code, and then this gets translated into declarative infrastructure by the Pulumi engine. The second term that I'd like to introduce you to is a Pulumi project. A project is essentially just a directory that contains Pulumi code. And there is a key thing inside a Pulumi project. There is this YAML configuration file that you can see here. Let me just change the actual brush color real sec quickly to red. There we go. There is this Pulumi.yaml file that lives inside these projects, and you can see I've output the what the contents of that here. This Pulumi.yaml file tells Pulumi which of the language SDKs that you are going to use, and then it also sometimes has options depending on the language. For example, here in this Python example, you can see that there is a virtual environment defined. This is taken care of. Setting up these Pulumi projects is taken care of for you by the Pulumi new command, which we'll be seeing shortly. And depending on the language SDK that you choose, the contents of this Pulumi project folder will be different. In this particular example, as I mentioned, this is a Python example. So you can see that there is a file in here that manages our Python dependencies in the requirements.txt. But essentially, like, these Pulumi projects is just a container for all of your Pulumi code. And it's essentially a directory on the file system of your machine. A Pulumi program lives inside a Pulumi project. So the relationship between a Pulumi program and a Pulumi project is that a program exists inside a Pulumi project. And a program consists of several resources that you manage as part of your Pulumi lifecycle. Your Pulumi programs can contain as many Pulumi resources as you like. They can have a single resource, or they can have hundreds and hundreds of resources. When you run the Pulumi update command, a Pulumi program is executed by Pulumi, and that's the thing that creates your infrastructure. That's the thing that actually talks to your cloud provider and creates that infrastructure for you. This is mainly what we're going to be operating today. We're going to be creating a couple of Pulumi programs and writing them out into our Pulumi project. The first term that is, I think, unique to Pulumi is this concept of a stack. A Pulumi stack is a configured instance of a Pulumi program, and what that means is that when you're writing your Pulumi program, there are often times when you actually want to add configuration values that differ between different environments. A common use of a Pulumi stack is if you want to apply the same Pulumi program to different environments, such as a development and a production environment, a Pulumi stack allows you to configure those values for that particular environment. And this is regularly used, as I said, switching between different environments. But there are other examples when this might be the case. For example, if you are operating in a cloud provider and you have applications running in multiple different regions, you may use Pulumi stacks to differentiate configuration values between those different regions. Pulumi stacks are very, very flexible. You can use them how you choose to use them, and it really depends on your workflow. I'll be showing you an example shortly of what a Pulumi stack looks like, but essentially it is this differentiation between configuration of different environments. And it may be the case that you don't actually need to use stacks at all if you only have a single environment and a single program. But we often find that our users very quickly get used to this stack concept, and they really like this ability to make configuration, to configure things in this way. You've heard me use the term provider a couple of times already. A provider is a thing that interacts with infrastructure on Pulumi's behalf. And it has two components that both need to be available in order for you to actually use Pulumi. The first is the language SDK. And you interact with the language SDK using the familiar programming language installation mechanisms that you are already familiar with. So for example, I'll be using Python today, so we'll be installing the Pulumi language SDK using the pip command. But if you are familiar with TypeScript, or if you're familiar with Go or any of the .NET ecosystem, you'll probably be familiar with terms like NPM, Go modules, and NuGet. So you need to install these language SDKs so that you can actually start writing your Pulumi programs. The second thing that you need is a binary or a plugin. And the Pulumi platform takes care of installing these plugins for you when you bootstrap your project. And you'll see an example of this shortly on how this works. Both of these things need to exist in order to actually create your infrastructure. And Pulumi takes care of installing these things for you when you create a new project. But it's important to be aware that both of these things need to exist in order for you to create Pulumi infrastructure. Then the final terminology that I'd like to talk to you about is the concept of a Pulumi output. And an output is a special value inside Pulumi. When you create Pulumi code, there are things that the infrastructure provider returns to you that are not known when you run your until you run your Pulumi program. Examples of this can vary and differ depending on the cloud provider. But if we think about Amazon Web Services as an example, when you create an EC2 instance, as a very simple example, the actual instance ID is not known until the cloud provider creates that instance. Another example that we'll see later is a Docker image. When you run a Docker container on your local machine, Docker generates a unique ID for that container that is not known until it's actually been created. These values are special in Pulumi, and we call them outputs. And then when you interact with outputs, you have to use them in a special way. What's fantastic about these outputs is that when you create two pieces of two resources that depend on each other, if a Pulumi resource generates an output and you pass that output to a second resource, Pulumi links them together and makes and understands that because it's waiting for this output, it should not make the second resource until the first resource has been created. And we'll see an example of this when we create our Docker container later. These outputs, it's really important to know, these outputs are still typed in our Pulumi language ecosystem. And so you know that the value that you're going to get back from that resource is going to be a string, for example, but you don't know what the actual value is. In this screenshot, by the way, you can see examples of an output actually like Pulumi knows what the outputs that are going to get returned are. It just doesn't know those values. And so you can see here in my my editor, you can see that I am the AMI and the ARN of this particular server is going to be available. And so you'll still get that auto completion in your code editor. And then last of all, we're going to talk about the Pulumi state. When you create Pulumi infrastructure, you have to store what the state of the world is in a state store. By default, you use the Pulumi backend, and I'll show you an example of setting that up in a few moments. But this state is what Pulumi uses to determine the difference between your running infrastructure and what the actual what Pulumi knows is the state. If you use the Pulumi.com backend, this is all taken care of for you, and it's completely transparent. You'll notice in this diagram here that you'll see the Pulumi CLI interacts both with the state backend and with your actual cloud provider. Pulumi never stores any of your cloud credentials in the state backend. So when you actually run your Pulumi up, none of the actual interactivity with the cloud provider happens outside of the context of your local machine. The state backend requires no credentials for your cloud provider. And it's important to know that all of the actual execution is happening locally on your machine. So we talked a little bit about all of the different terminology. Now let's talk about the Pulumi console. I've mentioned it a couple times before, but the Pulumi console is key in your interaction with Pulumi. When you sign up, when you get started with Pulumi, you'll need to create an account. Pulumi offers free accounts for individuals and paid plans for teams, as I already mentioned. But you'll need to actually create that account in order to kind of follow along. You don't have to do this if you don't want, but I would highly recommend starting off with an account right now. So let's quickly share my screen. And I'm going to move this to the side. And let's go to app.pulumi.com. So this, if you go to app.pulumi.com, this is what you'll see when you actually go to that console. You can navigate to this via pulumi.com. And you can click sign in, and it gives you options to sign in. If you have a GitHub account, as I do, I would highly recommend using the GitHub workflow. If you don't want to provide that information, you can sign up via email and click the don't have an account button. But I obviously already have an account as a Pulumi employee. So what will happen is that when you click the GitHub button here, it will ask you for permission to access your GitHub credentials, which is a perfectly normal thing as part of the GitHub SSO workflow, and then it will drop you into a environment like this. And you can see here I have access to the Pulumi Corporation, but you will not have access to the Pulumi Corporation, obviously. But you will get your GitHub username will be available in this drop-down box here. And obviously I have a bunch of different projects that are available that I've used previously, but you will have no projects. You don't need to click this new project button here. You can do this from the command line, and we'll do that in a few minutes. But essentially, this is what you need to be able to see here. And it's worth noting that you need to make a note of your Pulumi name, which is also your GitHub name, for some of the later content that we'll be doing. So you've created an account and you have logged into Pulumi at this point. Obviously now what you need is to install Pulumi on your local machine. Now the difficulty with this webinar is that everybody is using different operating systems, and everybody is using their own local environment. And so I can't actually show you a full example of setting up Pulumi on all of the machines that you are using. I'm using OS X, so you should be able to follow along if you need to. But there are multiple different installation options when you actually have, depending on your operating system. If you're using Mac OS, the easiest way to actually install Pulumi is to use brew install Pulumi. If you have already installed it, you can follow along. Windows, we have a chocolatey package, which will be installed with choco install Pulumi. And then finally, if none of those options really suits you, we have an installer script that you can use to actually install Pulumi, which will kind of detect your operating system and figure out for you which of the things that you need to install. And the way to it, and you can see that on the website, which I'm just opening up right now. If you just bear with me 1 second. So we have a fantastic screen here on the Pulumi website under Docs, Get Started and Install. So if you click Get Started, you click Download and Install on the left here, and then you could choose your different, depending on which environment that you have available to you, you can install Pulumi and select the selector here and install things. So I would highly recommend kind of following along with these installer mechanisms, depending on the operating system that you have available to you. And what I'm going to do really quickly is show you what actually gets installed on your machine. So I'm going to switch to a terminal here real quickly, and I'm going to increase the size. So what you're looking for in order to be able to use Pulumi is that you should have a Pulumi command available to you in your path. I can type the Pulumi version command here, and it should return the latest version, which is version 2.13.2, if you've used any installation mechanisms that I previously showed you. In order to actually know that you have a valid Pulumi installation, you need to check in the home directory, which is dependent on your operating system, for a .pulumi directory here. And you can see there will be a bunch of different directories available to you that are important. What's important to note here is that with this .pulumi version, this is where all the actual Pulumi stuff happens on your local machine. So the two things that you should feel familiar with, depending on your installation version, is that you have this Pulumi version, Pulumi CLI is available to you inside your path, and also that there's this Pulumi directory available. So the next thing that we need to be aware of is that we've installed Pulumi and it's now available on our machine. We now need to set Pulumi up so that we can interact with our state. Logging in is the way that you do that. There is the Pulumi login command that allows you to actually interact with the state. Depending on the state backend that you're using, the Pulumi login command will be different. But for this particular demo, I highly recommend just doing a Pulumi login command, and it will open a browser for you. So let's go back to my screen real quick. And you can see here, I am not logged in, so I'm going to do a Pulumi login command. And it will prompt you. You can either enter an access token, or you can hit the enter button. And then it's opened a web browser for me in the background, depending on the web browser that you use. And then I click GitHub, which is obviously the mechanism that I signed up with, and then it's going to tell you that I'm logged in. And here you can see it's going to give me a nice helpful tip so that I can have a look at some of the documentation. But you'll see that it's logged me in as this particular user. If I check my Pulumi directory, it now has a credentials.json file which contains my Pulumi login credentials. So you can know that you are logged in correctly by checking if that file exists. As I mentioned before, we have multiple different language ecosystems available. Node.js, Go, .NET, and Python. I will be using Python today, and depending on which of the things that you want to do, you'll need to actually have the language interpreter available on your machine. It's important that this is done depending on your operating system. If you are using Mac OS, you can just do brew install Python 3. If you're using any of the other operating systems, I highly recommend very quickly having a look at how to install those interpreters on your machine. Again, it's very, very difficult for me to show examples of all of these different operating systems. It really does depend on which operating system that you're using. So you just need to make sure that when you run the Python command or Python 3 command from your machine, that it actually returns a version. And if you want to follow along in any of the other language ecosystems, if you're familiar with them, just make sure that you have that interpreter available to you. At this point, we're actually going to go and start doing more of the interactive projects. As I mentioned before, these are all available as in a GitHub repo, which you can follow along and is in the is in the handouts, and this is what you're going to look at. And so we're going to start with lab 1, and then we're going to do lab 2, and then lab 3, and then lab 4. So please feel free to follow along with me, or you can just observe as you need to. But let's get started. So you can see here, I've created a directory called workshop, and this is an empty directory. There's no other directories in here. The first thing that we're going to actually want to do is just see an example of setting up or bootstrapping a Pulumi project. So what does that look like? You can type the Pulumi new command, and it will give you a list of all of the different templates that are available for depending on your cloud provider or what you actually want to do. I know that I'm going to be using Python today, so I'm going to close that real quick, and I'm going to do Pulumi new Python. As you probably saw there, it's possible for you to actually do Pulumi new cloud provider -language, or you could just do a generic Pulumi new Python. Pulumi will prompt you for a name for your project. I'm going to call mine workshop. You can also enter an optional description. I'm going to use the default here. And then finally, as we mentioned before, Pulumi has the concept of stacks. So it will prompt you for a stack name. The default is dev, but you can choose whatever you want here. And every Pulumi program must have one stack available to it. If you are using the Pulumi Teams, Team Starter or Team Pro or Enterprise, you can also optionally put these stacks in an organization. But everybody should have access to their own personal organization right now, which is the default. So I'm just going to use the dev stack, and you'll see that Pulumi will bootstrap all of my environment for me. So it's creating a virtual environment, and now it's also going to install all of the different Python dependencies that we need in order to get started. So it's created a virtual environment, it's installing all the dependencies in that virtual environment, and my new project is ready to go. Let's go back to the console real quick and see what happened there. So if I select my organization, and because I have a lot of different projects, I'm going to search for my workshop. And here is my workshop project. You'll probably only see one of these, but they're like, I have multiple, obviously. So you can see here it's created my my project, and I can click into that. And this is my dev stack. And it's not been updated, obviously, but there's a bunch of different tags on here. And if you want, you can see the activity. You can, once we start adding resources here, you'll be able to see them in the Pulumi console. And then there's also a bunch of settings that are available to you as well. So now that we've actually bootstrapped a Pulumi project, we're going to talk a little bit about configuration. And this is the key, these are key components to any Pulumi stack. You already saw Homeo talk about stacks and configuration. Pulumi has a series of commands that allow you to put configuration into your stack and then read them back. So you can see here, I'm talking about the Pulumi config command and the Pulumi config set command. And I'm going to show you examples in a few moments. But then you can also retrieve those values inside your code. And so once you actually set those values, there are options for you to actually retrieve that configuration. What's really important is that you can also set secret configuration values inside your Pulumi program. And these secret values are encrypted by a unique key that is individual to your organization or your stack. It's important that you pass its secret flag when you do this. But let's have a look at what configuration looks like to you. Back to my screen sharing. Okay, so we created a new Pulumi project inside this workshop directory, but we each Pulumi project has its own directory. So let's create a brand new directory inside here, and we'll call it Stack 1. We'll go into this stack. I'll do Pulumi new -y Python, which will just kind of, the -y flag just takes all the defaults. So it's going to call my project Stack 1, and it's going to install all the dependencies again. Give that a few seconds. Okay, so it's creating my new project, very similar to the ones we saw before. And now I'm going to open my editor, VS Code. And I'll open my main.py. And this is the basic Pulumi program that you kind of get presented with. All it's doing is importing, it's just importing the default Pulumi SDK. So let's set some configuration values. I'm going to start writing some code. So I'm going to create a variable in Python called required value, and then call this config. And then I can prompt with config.require required value. So you can see here I've got a sorry, I've just forgotten something. I actually need to specify equals Pulumi.config. There we go. That's much better. So I'm using the Pulumi SDK, Pulumi, and importing the config package. And then from that config package, I'm doing a config.require. So what have I actually done there? Let's take a quick look at a terminal. Inside my stack 1, and I'm going to run my first ever Pulumi up. And you'll see here that I've actually got some incorrect. Oh, that's white. There we go. Let's try that again. There we go. So you're actually seeing that I'm getting an error, and Pulumi is telling me what the problem is. Because I've made this value required, it's telling me that I have to please set a value using the command Pulumi config set. These required values here, when you use a require, it's telling Pulumi not to actually execute the program unless this has been specified in your stack. So I'm going to do Pulumi config set required value I am required. And then I'll rerun my Pulumi up. And now you can see that my Pulumi stack is going to execute. You get this kind of drop-down box. You can look at details about what's going to actually happen when you run the Pulumi up. But this is a very, very simple program. So let's just run up, and you'll see that it's been created. And you're wondering what has been created here. Inside the Pulumi state, all we've done here is tell Pulumi that we've created a stack. And so that's all that's currently happening at the moment. There are no resources to be managed as it stands. It's just we've created a very, very simple program. So let's enhance our program a little bit. Let's add an optional value. And you'll see that I'm going to use the get method here instead. Optional value. And then I'm also going to add a secret value equals config dot require secret value. And then finally, let's actually see what the content of all these things is. So let's do required value with a standard print statement. And if you're familiar with Python, you're probably thinking, oh, this is just a very, very simple print statement that everybody would use as part of their debugging. I've got autosave turned on, so that should be okay. So here you see I've set 3 values, one which is required, which we already set, an optional value, which will return none if it's not actually set, and then a secret value. Let's run my Pulumi up from this terminal. And as expected, this is setting an error because we had a required secret. So let's do secret value. And then remember, I have to pass the secret command at the end here. Rerun our Pulumi up. And you can see here in the diagnostics output, you'll now see that the values of those config commands are actually being output into my my diagnostics. You'll notice that my I am required that I set earlier on is now being printed. I haven't actually set my optional value. So as I mentioned, it's returning none. And then this one is particularly interesting because it's not actually outputting the plain text value. And the reason for that, as I mentioned before, is because we've made this secret. We don't actually want this to ever be passed in plain text anywhere in our Pulumi stack. If we take a look in our directory now, you'll see that there's this new file here, a pulumi.dev.yaml. And if you remember back to when we created our stack, we used the default dev to actually bootstrap this stack. So let's take a quick look at what's inside here. You'll see here that those values that I'm setting, the required value and the secret value that I ran from the Pulumi config set command, are actually set inside this file. And I really like to draw attention to the fact that when we pass the secret flag to the Pulumi config set command, Pulumi also knew that I don't want to store this value in my version control in plain text either, where anybody can see it. So it encrypted that value inside the actual stack as well. It's important that everybody's familiar with the idea that these secret values, they get passed all the way through Pulumi and its stack management, and they never get stored in plain text. They're always encrypted. Next up, let's create a new stack. In this example, in most examples, you probably want to have, a multiple stacks. So let's create a prod stack. And I can use the Pulumi Stack init command to do that. And then I can use the Pulumi Stack ls command, and it will show me all of the different stacks are available. You can see here from our dev stack that we have a single resource that has been created, which is actually the Pulumi provider itself. And then the prod stack has no resources in it. And it provides you this handy URL to go directly to the stack if you want to in the Pulumi console. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run Pulumi up. And you'll see that those values that we set in the dev stack have not been passed to the prod stack. So I now need to, again, set these required values between the different stacks. And the idea here is to show you that those required values are like all the config values that you use in a stack are specific to a stack itself. You'll see here that there is now no Pulumi.prod.yaml, but I can do Pulumi config set secret value, and let's just add prod here. And you'll see that it's now populated this prod stack, and those values are now different. We're not actually going to use this prod stack in the rest of these demonstrations, but I hope this gives you an idea of how stacks and configurations are essentially the same. Are related to each other, not essentially the same. These stacks are related to each other, are related to the configuration. So let's destroy the prod stack. We don't actually need it. It should give you a prompt that says prod, and then I could do Pulumi Stack ls and Pulumi Stack select dev. So now I'm back on my dev stack. Okay, so that's an example of configuration. Let's go back to the slides real quick and talk about what the next section. So we talked a little bit about stacks, and we used the init command to actually bootstrap those stacks. But what happens if you actually want to interact with stacks between different Pulumi projects? This is a very, very common workflow for our users. It's often the case that you will have a Pulumi project with a bunch of resources, and then a second Pulumi project with a bunch of resources. And those Pulumi projects, they can be in different languages, they can be in different cloud providers, but they may have some interactivity that you might need to use between them. So what we do here is we use something called a stack reference. You can actually export these values from these stacks and then use them either in your shell scripts, or you can use them in other Pulumi projects as well. So let's take a look at what a stack reference would look like. In order to actually do this, I'm going to rerun my Pulumi up to make sure there's no changes, which is what we expect. And then I'm going to go back to my editor. And I'm going to add this exported value. Config require value. And then finally, I'm going to use the Pulumi export command. And then I need to provide a name. and then actually specify the variable that I'm going to actually export. So you can see here I've defined this exported value variable, and then I'm going to export it. I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to change this to just a standard string here. So I've created this exported value, and then I'm using the pulumi.export command to actually export that value. Depending on the language SDK, the mechanism that you export these things is different. And so I would highly recommend looking at the documentation if you're using Node.js or Go to look at how these values are exported. Let's run a Pulumi up. And you can see that I've now got a change in my stack, and I now have an output, which is a exported value, and the actual value is I am exported from stack 1. I'm going to run that, and then I'm going to run the Pulumi Stack output command. It will show you all of the exported values, and then I'm going to run Pulumi Stack output, and then one of the actual output values, and you can see it will just return the actual string itself. So how can we use this in another stack? Let's go back up a directory and create a stack 2. We're going to use the Pulumi new command yet again to create a stack 2. And again, it's going to set it up for us. And now I need to open my editor in this new directory. So let's make this bigger. Open here. Make this a little bigger too. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we now have an empty Pulumi program again. Let's use some of the other Pulumi methods to actually grab these values. So let's create a variable called stack, and then do Pulumi.getStack. This will return the current stack we're in. As I mentioned before, we're mainly using the dev stack here, but when you switch between them, it will just set the stack for you. And then finally, I'm going to create, next I'm going to create a variable called org. And my org is obviously Jack Storm, which is my GitHub username. You need to actually fill this in with the organization that you got when you signed up with via GitHub. And so again, this is this particular value here. It will be different for you and me, but it's important that you actually set that correctly. So I specified that as my organization name. And then next, I'm going to create a variable called stackRef equals Pulumi.stackReference. And I can use a Python F string to interpolate these variables into a stack reference. And I'm going to very quickly fill this out, and then I'll tell you what I've done here. So a stack reference comes in the format organization, which is coming from this variable, stack1, which is the name of the original stack that we created, and then the actual stack name, which in this particular case is being retrieved from Pulumi.getStack. You could obviously hard code this to dev if you really wanted to, and you could also hard code this to this. But in order to make this reusable for everybody following along, I'm just kind of using these familiar Python like Python variable and string interpolation in order to actually make it easier for you to follow along. So now I want to grab my exported value, if you remember, from my other stack. So I'm going to create a new variable equals exported value, and then I'm going to use stackRef.getOutput. And you can see this is all being filled in for me by my IDE. And I know that if you remember correctly, I know the value of that output is exported value. So let's grab that. This will retrieve the value from stack 1. And then I'm going to export this inside here. This is just so it gets printed to the screen, essentially. I'm actually going to make this a little clearer from other stack. There we go. And so now we should be able to run this program, and it should return us the value from the other stack. Let's open up my terminal again and run Pulumi up. Here we go. It's going to create a resource, which is our provider. And it's read that value from the original stack one. And you can see here, if you remember, I did IAM exported from stack one. It's exported that value again inside this particular project. What I'm going to do here really quickly is open up my workshop project. Sorry, not my workshop project. I want Stack. Here's my Stack 1 project inside the console and my Stack 2 project inside the console. And I can go in here and I can see that it's got no actual resources, but inside the stack, it's got these outputs here. So you can see these values in the console as well as locally on your machine. So this has all been great. We know now how to we obviously know now how to pass configuration around. But for the last 15 minutes, you're probably thinking, oh, this is infrastructure as code. And we haven't actually created any infrastructure yet. And so let's do that now. I've intentionally made this beginner introductory workshop cloud agnostic. And so the idea here is that you would have Docker installed on your machine, and you can do this locally. In reality, a lot of the actual resources that you're going to be building are probably going to interact with cloud providers. But in a 1 hour workshop, I wanted to make sure this was relatively simple to follow along with. So let's talk about Docker itself. In this example, we're going to build a Docker image and we're going to run it as a container. So we're going to create a very, very simple Python web application. And let's always remember here that we can use the same language to build our Python web application that we can use to build our infrastructure. And then we'll run a very, very simple Docker container locally. Okay, so let's go back into our workshop directory and let's create a new Pulumi project called Pulumi Docker. And we can go in here. And our familiar Pulumi new command, which we've used several times now, we're going to create a new project. And obviously I'm passing the -y flag so that I don't have to fill out all the details again. And we're going to need another dependency here that's important for us to actually run this Docker container that isn't installed by default. Python has the concept of virtual environments. Depending on the language SDK, you probably may not need to do this, but in Python in particular, we need to activate our virtual environment. List all of the installed, all the installed dependencies. In this case, we got our Pulumi thing here. So now let's install pip3 install Pulumi Docker. So it's installing a bunch of packages for me that need to be installed locally. And unfortunately, because my machine has installed this multiple times, it's not detected that it needs to install the actual binary. So I can do Pulumi plugin install Docker p2.4.0. Oh, on your machine, you'll probably notice when you did pip3 install Docker, this probably happened automatically. You can do this manually if it fails, which is a rare occasion. If as a Pulumi software engineer, I'm constantly creating new versions of these plugins. So in this particular case, it failed. Essentially, what's going to happen when you run pip3 install is it's going to install this in the background for you automatically as part of that. But you can also do this manually as well by specifying a type, in this particular case, a resource, and the actual name of the plugin, in this particular case, Docker, and it's going to be installed here, version 2.4.0. What that actually did is it installed this particular, in the Pulumi plugins directory, it installed a binary for me, which Pulumi knows about. And so if you ever have a problem with these resources, it's always good to take a look inside this Pulumi plugins directory to make sure these resources exist. And you'll notice as a Pulumi software engineer, I have lots of different plugins and different versions available to me. It's probably the case that you'll just have a single thing here for the Pulumi resource Docker. Open up our editor and let's get started creating a Docker, creating an application. I've got my empty Pulumi program here as well. But as I said, we want to actually create an application. So I'm going to make a directory in here to store my application. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to create a main.py. And in order to speed us up a little bit, I'm going to copy and paste all of the code from the example. Here we go. So you can see here in Python, I'm importing the HTTP server package. I'm importing the socket server package. This is all very, very standard Python stuff. I'm going to write out in my HTTP server my name. Please feel free to change it to whichever you feel is appropriate. And then I'm going to specify a port. Next, I'm going to create a Docker file. And what this Docker file is obviously going to do is copy that Python application into the Docker container inside this app directory. So the main.py for our application, not for our Pulumi program, is going to get copied inside this Docker container. So I'm going to save that. And I'll do a quick listing. So inside your app directory, inside your Pulumi project, you should have a main.py and a Docker file. Back up one directory, open my editor. Okay, so how do we actually build a Docker container here? Let's make this a little bit configurable. So let's do our familiar get stack call. And then we'll also create an image tag variable, which we'll set to the value of stack. And you could just pass the stack directly. But what I'm trying to do here is just show you that this is just basically normal Python code. So I'm assigning the result of this variable to this variable. Okay, and let's build our image. I'll import. I don't actually need the whole package, so I'm going to do from Pulumi Docker import image Docker file. So when I did the pip3 install Pulumi Docker, this Pulumi Docker SDK became available to me, and let's create an image. Give the resource a name, my cool image, and then let's do build equals Docker file. Specify a context, which is this directory here. So we're basically saying to this Docker image, build a Docker file in the app directory. And then I want to specify an image name, which we will call my cool image tag, which is going to come from the stack name here. And then I don't actually want to push this to by default the Docker Pulumi Docker provider, when you build this image, pushes the image to a registry that's configured. And I don't want to do that right now. I just want to build it locally. So let's very quickly talk about what we've done here. We've built an image from the Docker file that we created in our app directory with this particular image name. Let's run Pulumi up from this directory. Cannot import name. Oh, it's because and of course in special oh, I see what I've done here. This should be Docker build, and this should be Docker build. This will teach me to not follow the instructions correctly. Docker build. Let's actually get it right. Docker build. You can see here, actually, this is a great example. It's showing me a standard Python error, cannot import name Docker build from Pulumi Docker. It's because that method didn't exist. So I made a typo in my code and it wasn't working. So now I've actually corrected that and I've actually set it to Docker build, which is the name of the method. And if I'd let the IntelliSense actually populate that for me, I probably wouldn't have made that mistake. So you can see here, it's going to build that image for me and it's going to build a name of my cool image. So let's run this update. You'll see it's creating my resource and I can run Docker images and you can see it's creating my cool image locally. So essentially this is showing you what would happen if you were using any other cloud provider. It's going to create that resource for you. It's going to create it locally on my machine in this particular case, but in most cases it's going to create that in whatever cloud provider that you actually want to use. Okay. Now we actually want to run the container. So let's do container equals container, and I need to import the actual container. There we go, and you can see this is the, if I'm actually letting the IDE do it for me, I can actually get it right the first time. So let's create a container, my running image, and then we can specify the actual image that needs to be specified for this particular container. We can pass it image dot. And so these are all the outputs from our image resource. And I can select them here. We want to specify the image name from this particular resource here. And that's where this value is coming from here. This image name value is coming from that image. And if we were going to run this together, what this is telling Pulumi is it's saying build the image first, and then after that, run the container. So it's taking care of all this for you. I'm going to really quickly copy and paste this. Unfortunately, I seem to have had a problem with my, I know this is actually wrong. So I'm just going to specify this here. So let's run this image like this. Run Pulumi up. I have a syntax error. Oh, because I haven't closed this out. There we go. There we go. And so now I've got a Docker image, which has already been created, and then it's going to actually run a container for me. So let's do that. I got an error. I think it's because there we go. That's correct. What it's trying to do, the reason it's failing is that it's trying to pull it from a remote repository, which we don't actually want to do. So let's rerun my Pulumi up. It's going to recreate my image. There we go. And it's running my image. And so this container ID value that I mentioned before is actually unknown when Pulumi runs. So what we want to do now is just grab that value and output it so that we could possibly use it in the rest of our Pulumi program. So let's do Pulumi.export container ID and then do container.id. And again, you can see it's auto populating these values for me. I can rerun my Pulumi up. It doesn't actually want to make any changes, except it's going to change the image in this particular case, and it's going to output the container ID. And you can see actually it's created that container ID. And I can actually run here a command that will actually grab the container ID directly from the stack and actually run Docker stats on it. So you can see here is returning that image for me. And so those values, we've created this piece of infrastructure. We've done it using a programming language and it's run locally. And as a result, we can now feel confident that we can actually create this, this infrastructure locally. So that's all we kind of had today. A couple of issues at certain points there, which I apologize for. Let's just quickly go back to the slides. And let's very quickly go over what we learned. Today, we kind of followed the Pulumi terminology. So you should be familiar with lingo like stacks, projects, providers, and the Pulumi console. We showed an example of managing the different configuration between different things in Pulumi, between the stacks, and we showed how to export those values. And we showed a very, very simple example of infrastructure that we can create locally. We built and ran a very, very simple Docker image that ran locally on our machine to show an example of infrastructure as code. There are more workshops coming up. If you are interested in AWS and Python, I will be running an AWS and Python workshop on Thursday. Please feel free to sign up. You can see that on our Pulumi Resources page. If you want to kind of go off and do this yourself, then please feel free to take a look at the Getting Started documentation. It's a great reference for you to be able to kind of follow along. And then there are much more complex examples in our Pulumi GitHub examples repo. So please feel free to kind of look at those. Again, please, I will encourage you to join the workshop.